Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Melanin Margin, the weekly chat show where conversations about race are never off the table. We're your hosts, Quaviondre Williams.
And Daquon Wilson.
So let's get into this week's conversation. What's hot on the table this week?
True crime and serial killer docuseries have made a resurgence recently with Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story created by Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan, which has been the most recent controversial addition to the genre. Netflix and the series has received a litany of backlash for a multitude of reasons since the series dropped. Many have criticized the show for exploiting trauma, including some of the victims' family. Rita Isbell, whose brother Errol Lindsay was murdered by Dahmer, told Insider Magazine, quote, "When I saw some of the show, it bothered me, especially when I saw myself, when I saw my name come across the screen and this lady saying verbatim exactly what I said. That's why it felt like reliving it all over again. It brought back all the emotions I was feeling back then," end quote. Isabel continues stating, quote, "I feel like Netflix should have asked if we mind or how we felt about making it. They didn't ask me anything. They just did it. I could even understand if they gave some of the money to the victims' children. If the show benefited them in some way, it wouldn't feel so harsh and careless. It's sad that they're just making money off of this tragedy. That's just greed," end quote. So, Andre, I wanted to ask you, do you think that true crime shows such as Monster romanticizes trauma and serial killers?
True crime or serial killer movies and TV shows always rub me the wrong way. Like I've talked about this before on my TikTok, but I love a good villain just as much as the next person. But serial killers are not villains. Serial killers are real people who have brutally taken innocent lives. I have no interest in their backstories because it doesn't matter to me. As we've said before, countless times, your trauma may explain your actions, but it does not excuse them. There are many people who have been through horrible, brutal, torturous life experiences who are not out in the world doing unspeakable acts. Serial killers make a choice to do what they do over and over again. So I have no interest in sympathizing with them because they could have just as easily chosen not to become the monsters that they are. The only people who should ever be receiving your sympathy are the victims, period, full stop. But segueing back to the question, I think Hollywood as a whole romances true crime and serial killers, especially with the casting choices they make. Teen girls have been fawning over Ross Lynch since his Austin and Alley days, and Evan Peters has droves of fangirls who loved his work as the tortured bad guy in several seasons of the anthology series American Horror Story. And they were both cast as Jeffrey Dahmer. Then there was Zac Efron, a popular teen idol from the movie High School Musical, who was cast as Ted Bundy in Netflix's Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile. And in all of these dramatized retellings, there was nudity and sexualization of each of these actors in their performances. This lets me know that Hollywood is fully aware that a certain demographic of people fetishize serial killers, and they lean into it with the hope of also bringing in the people who fetishize the actors with the promise of nudity. While I'm not questioning the talent of these actors, I just think that it's an interesting commonality that who they cast as serial killers also happens to be recognized heartthrobs. But I think that people are missing a lot in this conversation. It is the fact that these movies keep being made over and over and over and over again. People continue to want to dig their nails into why a killer kills, or let me clarify, why a white serial killer kills. Yet the voices of the victims they stole are left in the dust. The victims' families are still out there, and each time Hollywood does yet another film or TV show, they are re-traumatized all over again, just as we found out. And not just from seeing the body doubles of their loved ones brutalized all over again, but also, as we saw in Monster, their own testimonies and emotions taken on by an actor supposedly stepping into a character. The victims are not characters. Their families are not roles. They are real flesh and blood people who are being tormented over and over again. If a film or TV show about serial killers was to be done, it should only be through a documentary lens with a focus on the victims and with their approval. Moreover, any family members whose likeness or testimonies are used in these documentaries should be like compensated handsomely. But Daquon, I want to pass it back to you. I mean, do you think that serial killers and true crime are romanticized?
Absolutely. I think that there comes this icky feeling when you have all of these different docu-series and true crime films about serial killers because like you said, there are real people implied in these cases. It would be one thing if this was some fictional account of a serial killer. Then you can characterize the, person as much as you want to because at the end of the day, it's a character. But when you deal with something like the Jeffrey Dahmer story, you are dealing with him as a person as well as the people he murdered and their families. And I think that one of the biggest problems in this kind of genre is that so often they censor that serial killer. It's all about Jeffrey Dahmer. Yes, you get some of the victims, their backstories, whatever, but it's really censoring Jeffrey Dahmer, humanizing him. And I think that's where the problem comes because then you have people being like, oh, well, like he went through this trauma and I relate to this. And you're humanizing a literal monster. So it's one of these things where I think that in general, Hollywood does this exorbitant job at romanticizing these serial killers. And even if it's not intentional, even if we say they're just trying to tell the story that they want to tell, they know how serial killers are reacted to by so many fans. All of the true crime podcasts and everything like that, where they literally go in and do all of these different deep dives on these serial killers. It creates a loud voice for them and it humanizes them more than the actual victims they killed. If
Mm-hmm.
you wanted to do something about the Jeffrey Dahmer story, you should have talked to the victims. You should have talked to the victims' families. You should have done something to make sure that you are not censoring Jeffrey Dahmer, but censoring the victims and humanizing the victims because often they are just a piece of meat. Yes, they were killed, they were a person that was killed, but that's all that that's their legacy, quote unquote, in these films is that they died. They were a piece of meat that died. And that's really sad to think about. And it's like Isabel said, it's really greedy to profit off of trauma and violence, especially when it comes to a community that you don't belong to. Because let's be honest, one of the reasons why this Jeffrey Dahmer thing is so big is because so many of his victims were Black queer people, and that the white audience that Hollywood appeals to is doesn't care about seeing Black queer people get killed on camera because they're here for the white protagonist of the story, quote unquote.
Yeah, I agree. And another thing I find interesting about this, and I hate that I even have to bring this up again, but some of the same people who are empathizing with serial killers are the same people who were apparently so traumatized by Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars and still want him put under the jail. Like, these people have more empathy and understanding for a serial killer who brutally raped, molested, and ingested humans than for a Black man slapping another Black man for disrespecting his wife. I mean, TikToker Samira Rahim explained this phenomenon the best in a video response she did to another TikToker who said that she felt nothing at seeing the deaths of the Black and brown people who died at Jeffrey Dahmer's hands because she watched a lot of true crime, but she started crying when Dahmer was killed. Samara goes on to say that this is just the American media, or this is how the American media handles race issues and crime. When it comes to white serial killers, we are taught from an early age to think of them as an anomaly, as something that just comes out of nowhere, as these misunderstood people who are outcasts from society. And she explains that this is the system of white supremacy at work. She concludes the video by saying that if you can see 16 Black and brown people killed and feel nothing, but the one time the white male who is enacting violence is held accountable for his actions, you feel you have to come in and save him, that's the system working. Certain people are just more susceptible to the systems at play than others. And I think that she is 100% correct. I mean, let's take the news, for example. When the media reports on Black and brown teens who get caught up in gang violence and kill people or rob stores, the media talks about them with an adult lens and focuses on the victims, often referring to the teens who are responsible as suspects. No one discusses the positions those teens were put in by the family abuse, poor living conditions, or even mental health concerns. However, when school shootings happen by white teens, even as old as 18, many news stations still refer to them as kids and spend a segment talking about the shooter's whole life story and actually puts the victim stories as an afterthought. And it doesn't stop there. I mean, when we look at the insurrection at the Capitol versus the Black Lives Matter protesters and the reports on missing white children versus missing BIPOC children, I mean, this is because despite all the progress that we've made, white society still doesn't value BIPOC life in the same way they do theirs. More than that, when white serial killers specifically target Black and brown people, it clouds the perspective of the demographic of people who romanticize them even further. I think that's another contributing factor as to why many of the white gays and the straight white women were so enamored with the Dahmer series. They couldn't see themselves in his victims, so they identify with him. That's why often you'll see comments from white people saying things like, quote, this could have been any of us. And in the words of Samira Rahim, nah, this could have been any of y'all. Like, mental illness can lead someone to doing bad things, but mental illness does not equal serial killer. In an article written on BBC News, neuroscientist James Fallon accidentally discovered he was a psychopath after studying his own brain scans. When going through the scans, he noticed similarities between his own brain scan and those of the murderers he had been examining. Professor Fallon said, quote, you can't tell just by looking at the scans or genetics whether or not a person is a murderer or a psychopath, but you can see that they are going to have tendencies for certain traits that are consistent with that. He added, quote, it's not a death sentence, the biology, but it will give you some high potential for these things. So the genes are loading the gun and making someone vulnerable to becoming a psychopath. And what that says is that even with all the pieces to make someone a serial killer, they still can choose not to be. But Daquon, I think this brings up an interesting question. Why do you think that there has been such an obsession with true crime recently?
I think that it really comes down to a lot of people want to have trauma, quote unquote. They want to feel something that's happening to them. And I think it really shines when you listen to some of these true crime documentaries and you literally have people kind of reenacting in their heads, like, if this was me, I would do this, this, and that. And they're putting themselves in the shoes of the victims in the sense that, like, they have this know about to be like, oh, well, in this situation, I would do this, this, and that. Or I wish something like this would happen to me because I've done all of this reading. I know so much. I know how to handle this situation. And it's like, no. When something like this happens, you don't know that you're about to be the victim in some type of documentary. You don't actually know what's really going on until it already happened. And I also think that, it's kind of ironic that people are like, I felt nothing at these people being killed, but when Dahmer died, I felt something, because it's like, that could be your ancestors talking, who killed enslaved Black people and also ate them. But that's a conversation for a different day. But I think
Exactly.
that, like you said, there's this interesting kind of aspect to this where they have this connection to the serial killers in these documentaries, because they don't relate to the Black and brown people who
Yeah.
are being victimized and are the subjects of violence.
Yeah, I fully agree. Um, I think that there is something to be said about the way that people try to connect to these serial killers to try to find out what could possibly be the reason. I mean, it had to be something. And I think that sometimes what people don't realize is that a lot of bad people don't always have horrible backstories. Yes, there are some who do. Yes, there are some people who have been through some terrible things, but there are some who are just evil for the sake of being evil. I mean, that Joker quote really comes to mind where it's like some people just kind of want to watch the world burn. You know what I'm saying? And I think that people kind of, want to find just any kind of semblance of connecting, any kind of semblance to humanize these people in order to try to explain why they did what they did. And sometimes there is no explanation to madness. It's just evil for the sake of being evil.